We have a vision to be an international university of choice, anchored in Africa, dynamically shaping the future. Our mission is to inspire our community to transform and serve humanity through innovation and the collaborative pursuit of knowledge. To fully embrace the digital universe which we are beginning to inhabit, this is what we do at the University of Johannesburg. UJ, where the whole is far greater than the sum of its parts.
We are moving now to our second session for the day, and the theme of this session is technologies for research and learning. And in this particular session, we're going to explore how libraries can support research, both in the form of digital humanities, blockchain. You might be wondering how on earth blockchain has anything to do with libraries and supporting learning. And then we're going to look quite specifically at what we've done at the University of Johannesburg, using technology to support teaching and learning during the crisis. As with the other sessions, I'm not going to give a bio for each of the speakers. You can look up the bios on our website or our conference app. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Maria Frahm-Arp, and I'm the Executive Director of the Library at the University of Johannesburg. And it is my great pleasure to welcome as our first speaker, Paul Weinberg. Paul is a research associate with the South African Research Chair in South African Art and Visual Culture at the University of Johannesburg. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks for the opportunity to share some ideas. So just to introduce myself briefly, I've been working formally and informally with archives for about 40 years, and I have a passion and a deep interest in digital archives. And I've just recently, with a colleague, written a paper called No Way Back. It's about African photographic digital archives and how they find themselves and position themselves in the world today. So our history, much like what we consider our heritage in South Africa, has been a site of contestation for many years. At the end of the turbulent 1980s, protesters during the Defiance campaign descended on the Union buildings, as in this image. ANC flags were hoisted over what was once considered symbols of white supremacy in white South Africa. Fittingly, it was this exact space where Nelson Mandela was to be inaugurated 5 years later. In other parts of the country, these sometimes ironic intersections with history took place. Here, a Black Sash protest, a women's human rights activist organization, staged a demonstration in Pietermaritzburg against the National Party and the apartheid system, while Queen Victoria looked on in all her glory. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a young child oblivious to the ramifications of historic symbolism as she strokes the beard of a Boer War general in central Pretoria. In 2015, things took a dramatic turn with the removal of the Statue of Rhodes at UCT. Rhodes, the controversial empire builder and capitalist, had been a benefactor of the land on the upper campus where UCT stands. Here he looked north to Cairo with a sense of colonial hubris, once asserting that the whole continent would be part of the empire. Students involved in the dismantling of the statue held placards, somewhat paradoxically claiming, "Making history, not erasing it." A year later, art was burnt. The Rhodes Must Fall exhibition was vandalized by the transgender movement, which resulted in this historic exhibition never being shown to the public. Pertinent to the discourse of archives, David Goldblatt withdrew his archive from UCT on the basis that the university never stood firm on the issue of censorship. Sarah Barton's sculpture by Willie Bester was covered and later taken off campus. Jamison Hall, named after Leander Starr Jameson, famous for his part in the Jameson raid and close friend of Rhodes, was changed to the Sarah Baartman Hall. Shortly before all this, the Vice Chancellor of the university, Max Price, accused Peter Magabane, David Goldblatt, Omar Bacha, Willy Bester, and myself of contributing to institutional racism through our work. The debate has continued to simmer about whether what transpired at UCT was censorship or recuration. The discourse continues around the issues of the past, and its center is the notion of decolonization. Fast forwarding to the COVID-19 pandemic, it brought to the fore the inherent contradictions and continuing injustices in our society, and at the same time the death of George Floyd prompted a resurgence of Black Lives Matter that again raised the critical issues of systemic racism and poverty still prevalent in the world. As a footnote, 12 people died as a result of police brutality in our own country. In this time, we became reliant on digital media outlets for our communication needs, and we experienced a plethora of spectral responses, from fake news to highly subjective viewpoints that at times needed serious interrogation. At the top of the list was the US President's dismissal of the pandemic itself, his suggestion for taking untested medication, as well as the bizarre idea of drinking disinfectant to destroy the virus. But at the heart of the protests were symbols, and by association, heritage and archive in this time were not exempt from scrutiny. All this underlined the inherent value of the archive and its abilities to sustain information, and at the same time revealed the whimsical and fragile nature of popular social platforms. Reviewing archives in this time requires some thought. So let's look at what Paul Conway and Ricardo Punzalan have said about archives in the global sense. Over a span of just 2 decades, the creation of collections of historical digital objects has transitioned from rarefied experiment to nearly ubiquitous activity across both the commercial and non-profit sectors. Within the cultural heritage community of libraries and archives and museums, the multi-billion-dollar investment in building digital collections from photographic and other cultural resources has been framed by community-based guidelines and best practices developed by tightly circumscribed but overlapping networks of technical experts. At the same time, Bacchi, Periotti, and Prandoni suggest that cultural heritage has become democratized through digitization. Through digitization, they argue cultural heritage belongs to the mass. In the first world and through Europenia in 2015 and 16, 48 million photographs and 2 million audiovisual assets were digitized. So how does this reflect on where we are coming from in terms of Africa and our response to digitization? The imperatives driving this first world position are preservation, public accessibility, scholarship, and research. When applying this model to African collections and archives, repatriation and social justice should be included. In the context of colonization and apartheid, Harris and Hutting argue and state the case for South African archives. As in most countries negotiating a future from oppressive pasts, South Africa's heritage and broader memory sectors have been preoccupied by the need to recover marginalized, suppressed, and erased histories. The 21st century library, and particularly special collections in the archive, is about bringing the mountain to Muhammad. And let's look at a quick lexicon of what that could be. strutting one's stuff, institutional footprints, accessibility, meeting the user's needs, a shift from passive to active mode. And by that I mean not just waiting for someone to pass away before you collect their archive, but being proactive, a dynamic website, exhibitions and projects from the archive to stimulate and reimagine the archive for users and beyond, curation, bringing the past into the present, reviewing content and making it relevant, and the transporting of physical collections into digital, which requires a new and changing vocabulary. It's about new workloads, new skills, and new expectations. The ongoing journey into digital humanities, which is happening throughout the world. And importantly, collaboration and portals, which previous speakers have suggested and alluded to. In other words, what's mine is yours or ours, and what's ours is yours. And then, of course, the challenges of storage space and related issues, IT. As a photographer, I obviously, have a close relationship with the archive, and I see it as an incubator of history and memory. These are some images of the Nelson Mandela moment in our history. As a young activist and photographer in the 1980s, I was involved in an organization called Afrapix and Afrascope, and the archive was particularly precarious. And as an organization that challenged the apartheid state, we were raided in 1986, and our material was used for a treason trial. Post-1994, we look at archives from a position of Archives for Justice, and as Vern Harris from the Nelson Mandela Center and Memory Institution says, countering the dominant voices of the regime and building new ones. Photographic archives cannot fully acknowledge the depth of photographic history in many parts of Africa because of disruption, migration, loss, and the destruction of civic and personal archives, says Erin Hanley, author of the book Exposures, Photography in Africa. And Morton and Newberry suggest that the African photograph is at best a highly distributed object with endless micro-histories and a vast number of custodians, archivists, curators, consumers, and reproducers. So the digital moment in 2020 suggests that collections speak to each other regionally, continentally, and globally, and our individual collections become our national collections, and we see past territorial claims and parochialisms where we all can win. And those of you who from down under, New Zealand and Australia are real exemplars of how digitization can take place. They've created these incredible portals where private and public institutions share their assets. We've seen other examples in Holland, the Memory of Holland. Beeld en Geluid is a museum for film and audio visuals. In France, there's a similar institution that looks at digitization of film. Europenia, which I've already spoken about. In America, there's something called the Digital Public Library. The Memory of South Africa is still somewhat in progress and under construction, and we still have much to do in terms of building a national audit and devising strategies to enable private and public archives to build coherent national a coherence in national heritage, and to avoid our heritage becoming perpetually for sale and vulnerable. So I'd just like to share with you some collections and archival projects I've been involved with. I was a curator with a team on a project on the land, and we worked with 30 different photographers and 18 different institutions. This is Johannesburg, kind of at the time of 1886. This is the landscape, of rural South Africa. These are images of how leaders were portrayed. This is an image of people who were rounded up and sent to become laborers in different parts of South Africa, a historic image of the Bambata Rebellion. This is an image of San convicts. The interesting part of this bit of history is this became, they were interviewed, and it became the basis on the Blake and Lloyd collection that built a orthography of San language and their folklore and belief systems. This is again convict labor. This is Rhodes's farm, and these are images of post-war South Africa, post-war Anglo-Boer War. This image I'd just like to share with you is about the hut tax, and it comes from a postcard, interestingly enough. And this was obviously sent to the motherland, but it's the only recorded image of the hut tax, which resulted in the dispossession of peasants and their journey to the mines. These are the mines, images of the mines. I'm realizing that I need to just move on in terms of time. These images are of a portrait photographer who photographed people at the time of the Land Act. Very telling. And so this image, out of interest, is one would have thought that in South Africa you would have lots of these resources about this moment in 1949 when the Voortrekker Monument was erected, but I found none of these images, and I had to go to Getty Images in London to find them. Now the collection was about vernacular photography, Africans taking photographs of Africans. And here is a collection of material that became a book and a traveling exhibition. Here is a project that I did which brought the scattered collections of Afrapix together. I worked with Wits University, and it's relevant to our discussions. It's about a portal that brought these different disparate collections into one. I'm involved at the moment in a project called the Photographic Legacy Project, which brings together a whole range of digital archives into one, so that can be used for educational and research purposes. I'd just finally like to end with this portal also has a database which allows you to look at African archives that are around the world, as well as an inventory of African photographers. Just some concluding thoughts. So digitization encourages democratization of the archives. It encourages robust discourse and engagement. the concept of portals break down silos and institutional territorialism, and digital collections become part of national and global conversations. And finally, digitization encourages creative and reimaginative ways of looking at the past in the present. In conclusion, and just finally, just some thoughts about UJ, formerly the Rand Afrikaanse Universiteit, formerly once a white university that undergirded, if you like, Afrikaner nationalism. The question for UJ, and I work with the special collections and with Maria, is, so from an archivist and special collections perspective, how does the institution engage with its past and re-engage with its current collections? Does it, like UCT, simply remove all vestiges of historical uncomfortability out of sight, or does it engage with them to bring them into the present? I don't believe this process requires a COVID-19 pandemic or the voice of Black Lives Matter to provoke engagement or to catalyze with the past. I believe it is intrinsically part of our continual journey of self-reflection and what archivists should do as a way of critically evaluating their collections to enrich them on the one hand and deepen the discourse, however uncomfortable. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That was so interesting.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.